I am Frank Schumpert, your host, and you are listening to the Empires of History podcast, the Ottoman series, episode 9, Thunderbolt Turns to Europe. Please stay tuned to the end of the show for special announcements, other podcast recommendations, and a personal shout-out. In episode 8, we followed Sultan Bayezid as he took the throne and then cut a bloody swath all the way from Bursa to the Carmenid capital of Konya, where he prepared to lay siege. Along the way, we watched as Bayezid let his Christian troops off the leash and allowed them the freedom to pillage and generally cause loss and discontent throughout Anatolia. Completely ignoring the hundreds of political bear traps he was laying for himself as he smashed this or that Muslim beylik and took hostages from the local prominent families to ensure their loyalty when he had to turn his back on them, Bayezid finally came to the capital of the Carmenids. This time, in 1391, Bayezid had learned from the previous expedition with his father, Murad I, and had brought siege equipment with him that he planned to bring the walls down with. However, just as the Sultan had set up camp, news soon reached him that the remaining free beyliks, realizing it wouldn't be long before they too were up on the menu, had allied themselves with a powerful Carmenid general, Qadi Burhan al-Din. As you can tell from the Muslim title of Qadi, he was a local Carmenid judge who in wartime took over command of the various irregular horsemen to use them in devastating hit-and-run ambush raids against enemy invaders. Back in 1390, the same al-Din had tried to convince the various beyliks to unite under Carmenid leadership against the invading Bayezid. However, the task proved impossible, at least in the beginning. By the time Bayezid had reached Konya, news of the devastation wrought by his march had sufficiently scared the local rulers into sending him close to 10,000 men to oppose the Sultan. Unable to both besiege Konya and turn and face a united force of Anatolian warlords, the Sultan broke camp and ordered, in his now customary manner of lightning-fast marches, to head straight for al-Din, who was gathering forces close to Ankara in the north, and hopefully land a blow before any more troops could be mobilized against him. The last thing the Ottomans needed, Bayezid must have calculated, was for their army to move slowly and give the opposition time to consolidate even further. Bayezid signed a peace treaty with the Carmenid ruler, by which they agreed to withdraw from the conflict, revoke any authority invested in al-Din by the Bey of Carmenid, and remain a neutral in the coming conflict. Thus, like his father before him, who had found his ambitions of quelling the independent and rising power of the Carmenids stymied by events elsewhere, so too did Sultan Bayezid pack up and reluctantly leave the city of Konya as a thriving hotspot for anti-Ottoman scheming. Now, remember also back in episode 8 where we learned that Suleiman Pasha, the ruler of the beylik Kastamonu, had initially planned to join the fight against the Ottomans, but that he was stopped when Bayezid arrived unexpectedly, like a bolt of lightning, you might say, on his doorstep? Well, Suleiman had accompanied Bayezid on his conquest, serving the part of dutiful vassal, all the while hoping that the Sultan would remain none the wiser to his planned treachery. But during the march to Konya, Suleiman watched Bayezid marching to and fro, ripping apart marriage alliances set by Murad, and ignoring long-established treaties and traditions. He was furthermore incensed by the Christian troops supplied by the Byzantine and Serbian contingents, looting Muslim towns, and then torturing and massacring their inhabitants. Suleiman grew to fear what would happen during the Sultan's victorious march north. What if he decided to turn on his beylik? It certainly wasn't out of the question that he himself would be executed and the territory annexed directly into the empire. When news reached the Sultan's camp that al-Din had gathered an army and was on the march, Suleiman decided to make his move. While the main Ottoman army was still breaking camp, Suleiman and his men, some 3,000 we are told, abandoned their tents and rode out with only a few provisions and their horses in an attempt to join up with al-Din. Watching as Suleiman abandoned camp, Sultan Bayezid, it is recorded, flew into a rage and ordered the fastest cavalry units of the Ottoman force to peel off and pursue the deserters. Leading his force of men, Suleiman rode day and night, hoping to outpace the Ottomans. But, as it turned out, al-Din wasn't just outside of Ankara, but a further day's ride east of it. After 2 weeks of being on the run, and the dust from the Ottoman riders seen in the distance, Suleiman turned command over to a subordinate and rode off by himself, hoping to make it to Kastamonu. Meeting his force the next day, the Ottoman cavalry, supported heavily by mounted Christian knights, routed Suleiman's force. The sources record that the captured men, who it is also reported barely lifted a finger to fight, were executed to a man on the Sultan's orders. The deed being carried out by Christian knights, who happily, records the chroniclers, made a spectacle of torturing their Muslim prisoners before dispatching them. Suleiman himself was captured just outside of Kastamonu and turned over to the Sultan. Bayezid promptly ordered his execution, as well as the full annexation of the Beylik. Another neighboring Turkish Beylik, who only weeks ago was contemplating heeding al-Din's call to unite, thought the wiser of it after the terrible fate of Suleiman, and on his own accord swore loyalty to the Sultan, hoping to avert Bayezid from swinging his army north and gobbling up his territory. The next phase of the story gets a little confusing. Not the least bit is that the historical sources all seem to contradict themselves during the course of events collectively known as the Battle of Kirkdilim. As you might have guessed it, this was to be the epic battle between what was left of the free Turkish Beys, led by al-Din, against the formidable forces of Sultan Bayezid. This is how the story of the battle is told from al-Din's perspective, come down to us by the pen and hand of one Aziz bin, a court chronicler of the Carmenids, accompanying al-Din in his wonderful work Bazm-ul-Razm. In it, he recounts a battle near a small village located about 10 miles southeast of modern-day Ankara called Kirkdilim. In the battle, the Ottoman cavalry are routed by Anatolian horsemen, hiding in the hills nearby, and the Sultan was forced to retreat from the field and return to Europe. This account, however, records no great follow-up on the recent Ottoman conquest and the subsequent freeing of beyliks conquered by the Sultan. Instead, it records the Grand Alliance breaking down soon after the battle, as petty squabbles took over from the spirit of brief unification. This differs greatly from the Ottoman account of the battle given to us by Emperor Manuel II, who was serving as the Sultan's vassal. In his memoirs of the campaign, Manuel records the main Ottoman army arriving mostly unopposed outside of Kirkdilim, and the Christian troops, shamefully recounted, ravishing the surrounding countryside to such a horrendous extent that even Bayezid threatened to deploy his janissaries to reel them in. Even the timeline for the battles are different. Manuel says the Ottomans were in the area for weeks, while Aziz bin puts the battle a mere 2 days. In any event, it appears as though Sultan Bayezid didn't suffer a devastating defeat that would send him running. That would come years later, trust me. But instead seems to have fought what we'd call a counter-guerrilla campaign against al-Din's forces, before finally receiving news from Europe in late 1391 that King Sigismund of Hungary was causing trouble by launching raids in those parts of Bulgarian Ottoman hands, and were attempting to turn the Serbians against them. Plus, word also reached Bayezid from his governors in Europe that their spies reported that the King of Hungary was busy bribing court officials in the great powers of Christian Europe, hoping to start up another crusade, this one aimed right at the Ottomans. Ever living up to his name, the Thunderbolt, the Sultan didn't waste a day in the councils of his advisors, old wise men from Murad I's days, and ordered his army to march with all haste to Europe, Sultan Bayezid's campaign into Anatolia looked great on paper, or a map more specifically. He had conquered roughly twice the territory in Anatolia that had taken his father 20 years to carefully assimilate, coordinate, and integrate into the larger empire. Four more independent Turkish Beys, long proud of their autonomous status that even the Seljuks hadn't bothered to crack them, were now ruled by Ottoman governors, most of them boon companions to the Sultan himself, and not appointed for any special gift in administration. Yet another clear break with that old, excellent Ottoman tradition of putting the most highly capable man on the job. As the Sultan marched with his army, he left behind him a vast territory whose mastery was only skin deep. Underneath the veneer of obedience beaten into them by the Sultan's harsh Christian troops, a rage simmered as the inhabitants watched the Ottomans leave. Bayezid arrived in the southern part of Bulgaria, controlled by the Ottomans with his army numbering by this time 12,000, once his Christian vassal troops had been discharged from service in late 1391. His first order of business was to summon the irregular cavalry raiders, the dreaded Akinci, where he charged them to freely raid as far away as Hungary and even deep into Greece. The Akinci were, thus, let loose to raid, plunder, and kidnap Christians to be sold as slaves in the Islamic slave markets of the Mediterranean. At this point, I'd like to introduce a character who would define the last years of Sultan Bayezid's reign in Europe, King Sigismund of Hungary. Famous in history for the disaster at Nicopolis, the failed crusade launch to boot the Ottomans out of Europe, he proved in his life to be a cunning and dangerous foe for the Ottomans, and, even worse, capable of bringing large resources to bear against the sultans. Resources sultans past had always been wary of and keen not to provoke. King Sigismund was born February the 15th in 1368, Nuremberg, which was then a part of the Holy Roman Empire, and he was the last male heir of the House of Luxembourg. In 1374, when only 6 years old, he was betrothed to Princess Mary of Hungary, her father the powerful King Louis the Great. In 1378, Sigismund's father passed away, and the boy was sent to the royal court in Hungary to be raised by the king and educated in the Hungarian language and customs. It was during this time that young Sigismund fell in love with his adopted country and learned from the king the danger posed to Hungary and Central Europe as a whole from the Ottoman Empire in the south. King Louis would struggle, as would his heir Sigismund, with powerful local barons intent on maintaining their independence at all cost against the growing Ottoman threat. The same barons who often acted recklessly in actions against the Ottomans, and when the Turks finally broke into Hungary a century later, these local barons were the first to convert to Islam and serve the Ottoman state. At the age of 13, Sigismund was sent to Poland to stay with relatives of the Hungarian royal court. While in Poland, Sigismund learned to speak Polish, a feat added to his growing list of mastered languages. In 1382, King Louis died, and Mary, Sigismund's betrothed, became Queen of Hungary. The pair finally married in 1385, with Sigismund becoming co-ruler, and was finally crowned king in 1387 at the age of 17. It has been said that Sigismund's troubles truly began after he became king. Upon assuming the throne, the barons rebelled in favor of another relative of the deceased Louis. I'm not going to get too much into the internal politics of the Kingdom of Hungary. Instead, I'll treat it much like I have the Byzantines. Suffice it to say that after nearly 3 years of internal strife and rumors of one faction or another having struck a secret Ottoman alliance, Sigismund would be able to call himself unopposed ruler by 1389. King Sigismund learned of the Battle of Kosovo in 1390, and seemed to be one of the few rulers who realized the scope of the Ottoman threat to Europe. He sent ambassadors to the major courts in Europe, Paris, Rome, Burgundy, and even London, beseeching Lord and Lady to heed the danger posed by the Ottomans, and implored the various rulers to come together in a great crusade, resulting in what would become the famous Battle of Nicopolis, which I will cover in episode 10. And that wraps up episode 9. When next we pick up, we will learn that the machinations of King Sigismund would eventually lead to a full-blown crusade against the Turks. Oh, I wonder how Sultan Bayezid will respond. I'd like to end today's show by giving a special thank you to listener Rob Coughlin. During the show, you may have noticed my pronunciation of Anatolia switched to the corrected version, Anatolia. Many thanks for that, Rob. Also, in case you are harping for a great history podcast to listen to, might I suggest Age of Victoria podcast? I'm all caught up after having binge listened to host Chris Fernandez Packham over the holidays. If you are skeptical, I suggest starting out with episodes 13, 14, and 15 that cover the Mount Tambora eruption and its devastating effects on the world. Once you are thus satisfied and any doubts laid to rest, you can start like I did from episode 1. Really, gang, you won't be disappointed. I certainly wasn't. On the note of podcast, I really hope you enjoyed my interview with John McHugo during the release of the special episode before the holidays. I am throwing around the idea of doing an author's interview portion and would love to make it a regular occurrence, but never at the expense of their show. I appreciate the feedback from my interview with McHugo, and if anyone out there has any suggestions of someone they'd like to hear on the show, please send me an email. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider supporting the show by going to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and by visiting the show's website at all one word, empiresofhistorypodcast.blueberry.net. That last part is spelled BLUBRRY.net, where you can comment and subscribe. Feel like supporting the show? You can stop in at Patreon under the show's page and make a donation. Any little bit would help. All proceeds from Patreon are poured straight back into the show in the form of purchase of books and scholarly articles on the subject matter. As usual, if you feel I can improve the show, please drop me a line at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. That's empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Many, many thanks.